Dana White is certainly one of the most recognizable faces in combat sport history. Thanks to him, MMA went from being an illegal sport that was considered too violent to be watched to now a mainstream entertainment. And if you are watching MMA today, it is probably because of him. But along the way of his success, he would create many controversies due to his rather spontaneous personality as well as his decisions. So today we're going to explore the unquantifiable impact Dana White had on the entire fighting scene. But before we get into the neat stuff and the drama, let's talk about why Dana White is popular in the first place. The UFC wasn't always owned by Dana White, and the first UFC event was very different from the organizations we know today. MMA was first created to make a common ground for every martial arts to fight each other, with the objective of finding out which one would be the best. And in that trajectory, the first UFC event took place. It was made as a tournament, so fighters from different combat sports could fight each other. It was revolutionary. It would have been an incredible idea that would not only settle the difference between the different sports, but also would be a great piece of entertainment, except for the fact that there were absolutely no rules, which mean no time limit, no weight category, no glove or mouthpiece, and in that context many of the fights were stopped really early due to injuries, for example. After the event, the sport was then qualified as an extremely violent and dumb sport, and it even became illegal in several states of the USA, and that's when Dana White wanted to take the lead of the association. So with the financial help of two of his friends, he bought the UFC and became the official CEO. He would implement many changes regarding the rules, but also make many changes outside of the octagon. But the UFC wasn't successful yet. It needed better publicity because even if the sport had new rules and it was much better than before, it was still a niche sport that was unknown to the general public. So the company needed something that would make them known, and with that goal in mind, Dana White will launch The Ultimate Fighter. The Ultimate Fighter is a reality show in which new fighters try to get a contract with the UFC and have the opportunity of becoming professional fighters. The show consisted in two teams of 8 to 16 new fighters depending on the season. The teams were named after the coach they had, who was an already known UFC fighter. This was genius in so many different levels. The UFC was able to find fighters with high potential by first making them fight, but also by seeing the personalities, which is great for press conference, for example. Also, the beef between the teams of already known fighters would make the audience really involved in the show. Dana White also had a strong personality, which suited the show quite well.
You're wasting his time and my time and your own time. We're here for 16 more days. Get to work.
Some of the great names of the sport came out of this series, like Tony Ferguson, Michael Bisping, and even Nate Diaz. But more importantly, The Ultimate Fighter had an incredible success, bringing a lot of attention to the UFC and therefore make it more successful. The show isn't as popular now, but it still created many memories to the public. Dana White would then make a series of decisions that would have a positive impact on the UFC and would help it to grow as the organization we know today. Some of his best decisions were, for example, the collaboration with USADA, which would bring drug testing to the next level and make it much more difficult for fighters to take PED. He would also heavily promote women MMA to the public, which helped a lot in the creation of female UFC stars like Ronda Rousey. I also think the UFC is one of the reasons for the super fight between Ryan Garcia and Gervonta Davis, which seems like a crazy statement, but let me make my case. Recently, MMA gained a lot of popularity to the detriment of boxing. But why, you may ask? Well, there are many different boxing associations, and the big name of boxing don't try to fight each other. They will rather take easier fight, which will make them keep the belt of their association as well as their undefeated records. But because MMA has only one big association, the stars of the sport would be obligated to fight each other simply because they are just one belt. So the super fight between Garcia and Davis happened in the objective of bringing some light back to the sport of boxing.
You know, it was more of a sacrifice to help save boxing because the boxing was boring. Nobody was talking about it.
Another thing that people can like about Dana White is his personality, which can be described as spontaneous, to say the least.
I don't give a fuck.
And as we will see, his personality will cost him a lot of drama. But now that we've cleared up what Dana White brought to the MMA and overall fighting community, let's start to talk about what you would rather forget about him, the dark side of Dana White. And we will start from the lightest to the heaviest drama he created. In 2028, the UFC decided to change the belt. It was made in the objective of modernizing the organization, and contrary to popular belief, there is no evidence to support that the belt is cheaper to make. So the belt change wasn't driven by cost reasons. But to many fans, including me, the belt was just too iconic to be replaced. It looked big, chunky, but also majestic, and I think the belt now definitely doesn't look as good. But this is only subjective. Due to the nature of MMA, accidents happen and sometimes have a much higher consequences than any other sports. And when a fighter or referee messes up in the octagon, Dana White usually fires them the same night. It is still better than not acting on it, don't get me wrong, but the fact is that the decisions are taken in the heat of the moment, where maybe a sanction would have been more appropriate. The Dana privilege is a common expression in the MMA community. It describes the fact that the fighters who have a flashy fighting style have a much easier and faster road to the title shot. You see, Dana White usually puts the interest of the UFC above MMA. So to put it simply, money is more important than the right choice for the sport. So when a fighter has a flashy style with knockouts that a lot of people want to see, and therefore the fighter makes more money, have a much easier time to get a title shot. The prime example of that is Sean O'Malley. Thanks to his style, he really became a favorite amongst the fans, and he only needed to fight 2 ranked fighters before getting a title shot. The opposite end of it is Belal Muhammad, who because of his style and the fact that he mostly wins by decision, has a much harder time getting a title shot. MMA fighters usually dehydrate themselves to make themselves lighter at the time of the weighting, so they can gain that weight back for the fight. The problem in that process is that even while being surrounded by professionals, it has a lot of repercussions on the fighter's health. But because everyone is doing it, if you want to be competitive, you have to do it as well. The water cut is a well-known problem, but the UFC doesn't seem to act on it in any way, even though solutions exist, like hydration tests, which other associations have already implemented well, but an even simpler idea would be to bring the official weighting much closer to the fight. In that case, fighters would be forced to cut less weight if they wanted to be in the best shape for the fight, which would significantly reduce the health issues with the water cuts. The first main event of the UFC 200 was Conor McGregor against Nate Diaz 2, which would end up being replaced by Daniel Cormier against Jon Jones, but Jon Jones would then fail a drug test, so this fight couldn't happen either. So Dana had to get his last chance of putting a main event by announcing the return of Brock Lesnar. Brock Lesnar would then win the fight against Mark Hunt, but the controversy surrounding the fight would then be revealed after it occurred. The next day of the event, it has been revealed that Brock Lesnar was tested positive for drug tests 10 days prior to the event, but the UFC didn't act on it and let him fight. It's probably because Dana didn't want to lose its main event again, but the revelation would create a massive backlash from the fans. Mark Hunt would also understandably try to legally sue the UFC for this event. Brock Lesnar would then be suspended for 1 year and would have to give a quarter of his salary to his opponent. This soft sanction would heat up the critics even more. In January 2023, a video surfaced of Dana White slapping his wife. The video was posted by TMZ, which included an interview with Dana White on the subject, in which he said that it was never okay to hit a woman in any situations and apologized for it. But it didn't stop the massive backlash he got for it. Due to this controversy, he also had to delay the first event of slaps, for obvious reasons. Dana is also known to use some questionable techniques to pressure a fighter into signing his contract, public shaming, or even announcing a fight without the fighter knowing about it, to force them to sign if they don't want to cancel the fight. And because the UFC is the only big MMA organization, they usually have the upper hand in the negotiations, and they don't seem to forget about it. Never ask a woman her weight, a man his salary, and Dana White about fighter pay. One of the biggest criticisms of the UFC is fighter pay. You might think that getting paid $3 million for a fight is incredible if you are an UFC star, but when you compare it to boxing, it is absolutely ridiculous. While the average boxing star typically gets half of the total revenue of the events, which they split between the two fighters, the UFC stars get about 1 to 2% of the events. And boxers can even make more money with sponsorship, which isn't the case for the UFC, because the fact is that sponsor pay the UFC and not the fighter itself. And Dana White doesn't want to change that at all.
It's never gonna happen while I'm here. Believe me, these guys get paid what they're supposed to get paid.
Note that it is only true for the stars of the sport. If we are talking about the average salaries, then MMA fighters make more on average than boxers. There are just too many fighters that had disagreements with Dana White, so for the sake of this video, I'm going to talk about just 2 cases, which I think are a good representation of the way he treats fighters. Demetrius Johnson is a flyweight fighter who became an UFC champion in September 2012. He also defended his title for over 6 years with 11 title defenses. And he also never had any problems outside of the octagon. He honestly was the perfect champion. So what went wrong? Well, because of his weight class and because the UFC didn't really promote him, Demetrius wasn't bringing a lot of money to the UFC compared to other champions. So around 2019, the UFC would decide to trade him with Ben Askren. Ben Askren ended up losing 2 of his 3 fights in the UFC, while Demetrius was finally more considered in his associations. But it doesn't stop there. Dana would end up talking in the back of Demetrius by saying he had the lowest pay-per-view rate of any champion.
He has the lowest selling pay-per-view in the history of the UFC in the modern era.
Which is first really unprofessional, but even weirder considering the UFC was also part of the problem. And when Dana is asked about his top 5 best UFC fighters, he of course doesn't mention Mighty Mouse and tries to ignore him, even if he is objectively one of the best fighters of the UFC and is way better than Conor McGregor, for example. The second case is Francis Ngannou. I won't go in detail of what happened because it can be a video of its own, and other YouTubers have already talked about the subject really well. And unfortunately, the rivalry between Francis and Dana would probably prevent one of the best fights that would happen for the sport, which is Ngannou against Jon Jones, even if both fighters said that they wanted to make it happen. So what should you think about Dana? Well, honestly, I don't really know myself, because if it wasn't for him, I might have never been interested in MMA, and the UFC just wouldn't be a thing or would be much smaller. But on the other hand, he really has questionable ways of negotiating and overall working, without even counting all the drama he has been around, and there are many other drama that I haven't mentioned in this video, so it's only up to you to make your own decision about the subject.